Welcome back, everyone, to a new story. We really hope you enjoy it. Marcus, what the hell did you put in my coffee? The words escaped my lips before I could process them. A raw reaction to the unfamiliar taste spreading across my tongue. It was bitter, yes, but not the clean, familiar bitterness of the dark roast I brewed for myself every single morning at 6:15 a.m. or sharp. This was a murky, chemical bitterness, and as it slid down my throat, it left a strange, saccharine aftertaste, like burnt caramel mixed with something vaguely medicinal. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, a smudge of charcoal on his cheek and his paint-splattered jeans looking like they'd lost a war with a rainbow. He was the antithesis of everything I stood for. My life was a spreadsheet ordered, logical, every cell accounted for. I was a financial analyst, and my apartment, or at least my half of it, reflected that. Everything was grayscale, minimalist, and obsessively tidy. Marcus, a struggling artist who communicated in sarcastic mumbles and abstract canvases, lived in a state of perpetual creative chaos. His side of the apartment was a controlled explosion of color, clutter, and the faint, lingering smell of turpentine. We were roommates for one reason and one reason only. Rent in this city was brutal. For him to make coffee for me was an event so rare it bordered on the apocalyptic. Usually, our morning interaction consisted of a grunt from his direction as I showered and dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and pressed slacks, headed for the door. He offered a lazy, infuriatingly smug smirk. It's a new artisanal blend. Notes of vanilla and existential dread. Thought you'd appreciate the complexity. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 7:45 a.m. I was already 10 minutes behind my rigidly scheduled departure time. I didn't have time for his games. Against my better judgment, I took another large gulp, grimacing at the flavor but needing the caffeine. It tastes like poison. "Don't be so dramatic, James," he said, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. In the rush of the moment, I dismissed it as his usual condescension. He saw me as a soulless corporate drone, a robot in a suit. He made no secret of his disdain for my life's predictable trajectory. "Just don't touch my coffee maker again," I snapped. Rinsing the mug and placing it precisely in the dishwasher, I grabbed my briefcase, straightened my tie in the hallway mirror, and ran a hand through my short, neatly combed brown hair. The reflection was familiar, reassuringly so sharp jaw, clear blue eyes, a face that was handsome in a severe, forgettable way. It was the face of a man who got things done, who didn't have time for feelings, let alone artisanal coffee blends. I slammed the door behind me, the strange taste still clinging to the back of my throat. The day started normally enough, aside from the odd feeling humming just beneath my skin. Sitting on the crowded subway, I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest, a jittery energy that wasn't just the caffeine. My heart was thumping a little too fast, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I chalked it up to the horrible coffee and the stress of an upcoming quarterly review. Control yourself, James, I thought, gripping my briefcase tighter. Emotions are just noise. Data is truth. But the noise was getting harder to ignore. At the office, I found my focus wavering. The familiar comfort I took in the endless columns of numbers on my screen was gone. Instead, my mind drifted. I noticed the way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, the soft lilac color of my coworker Donna's blouse, the gentle rhythm of her breathing as she typed at the desk next to mine. These were details I had never paid attention to before. They were irrelevant, inefficient. By lunchtime, the warmth in my chest had intensified, and my skin felt sensitive. The starched collar of my shirt, usually a comforting sign of professionalism, chafed against my neck. I felt a weird prickling sensation, a heightened awareness of the fabric against my skin. Then came the meeting. We were reviewing a portfolio, a dry, numbers-heavy presentation that I could normally navigate in my sleep. But as my boss, Mr. Henderson, droned on about market fluctuations, I felt a bizarre lump forming in my throat. His voice, usually just a monotonous background hum, suddenly sounded so weary, so sad. I looked at the slight slump of his shoulders, the deep lines around his eyes, and was hit with an overwhelming wave of sympathy for this man I barely knew. My eyes started to burn, To my absolute horror, I could feel them welling up with tears. I blinked furiously, staring down at the polished mahogany of the conference table, my knuckles white as I gripped a pen. What is wrong with me? The question screamed in my head. Crying in a budget meeting. It was the most unprofessional, most illogical thing I could possibly imagine. I feigned a cough, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes and willing the absurd emotional surge to subside. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of confusion and shame. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact, terrified of another inexplicable emotional ambush. The world seemed to have turned up its saturation. Colors were brighter, sounds were sharper, and emotions mine and, inexplicably, those of the people around me felt raw and exposed. When I finally got home, the apartment was empty. Marcus was probably at some gallery opening or holed up in his studio. I was grateful for the silence. I loosened my tie, my fingers fumbling with the knot. I felt exhausted, but not in the usual way. It was a deep, bone-weary fatigue, as if I had run an emotional marathon. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. It was the same face, the same man, but something felt different. The jittery energy was still there, a low-grade hum beneath the surface. My skin seemed flushed, warmer to the touch. I splashed cold water on my face, the sensation startlingly vivid as I dried my skin. I thought back to the morning, to that smug look on Marcus's face and the chemical sweetness of the coffee. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a terrifying variable in the carefully constructed equation of my life. What had he done? What was happening to me? The questions echoed in the sterile silence of my bathroom, and for the first time in a long, long time, I had no answers. I felt a tremor of fear, an emotion I had always prided myself on keeping locked away, but now the lock was broken. The days that followed were a quiet nightmare, a slow-motion unraveling of everything I thought I knew about myself. The initial emotional storm didn't entirely subside, it just changed its nature. Instead of sudden, overwhelming waves, it became a constant, high tide of sensitivity that I was powerless to control. A television commercial for a phone company, featuring a father and his daughter, left me misty-eyed. A sad story from Donna about her sick cat had me rushing to the men's room to compose myself, my throat tight with unshed tears. I, James Anderson, a man who considered sentimentality a critical character flaw, was becoming a walking soap opera. It was mortifying. I started avoiding conversations, eating lunch at my desk, and keeping my responses to emails curt and impersonal. I was building a fortress around myself, but the traitor was already inside the walls. Then the physical changes began. It started with my chest. A dull, persistent ache settled deep behind my sternum, a tender throb that felt like a muscle pull. Except it wasn't. It was a strange, pulling sensation, as if something inside was being stretched. Within a few days, the ache sharpened into a distinct sensitivity, the crisp cotton of my undershirts, a daily uniform I'd worn for years without a second thought, became a source of constant, low-grade torture. Every movement, every breath, sent a flicker of discomfort across my pectoral muscles. The area around my nipples, in particular, became so sensitive that even the spray from the shower felt intense. I told myself it was stress, my company was in the middle of a merger, and my workload had doubled. Of course, I'm feeling it physically, I rationalized, rubbing my aching chest through my shirt. It's just tension. But the denial grew thinner each morning. About a week after the coffee incident, I was getting dressed when I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror on my closet door. I stopped, my hand frozen on my tie. There was a subtle but undeniable change in my silhouette. My chest wasn't flat anymore. There was a slight puffiness, a soft swelling that hadn't been there before. My heart hammered against my ribs. I moved closer, peering at my own body as if it were a stranger's. Tentatively, I reached out and pressed a finger against the tender flesh. It was soft, yielding, and a sharp, almost electric pang of sensitivity shot through me. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. It felt glandular, real. This wasn't muscle. This wasn't fat. This was something else entirely. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my carefully constructed walls of logic. The changes didn't stop there. My skin, which had always been ordinary, prone to razor burn and the occasional blemish, started to transform. It grew softer, smoother. The fine hairs on my arms and legs seemed to be thinning, becoming lighter. When I showered, my fingers would glide over my own shoulders and stomach with a disconcerting lack of friction. The texture was different, less coarse, more supple. I'd find myself unconsciously touching the back of my hand, marveling at its newfound softness with a mix of fascination and revulsion. My body, the one predictable, reliable machine I had always inhabited, was betraying me. It was rewriting its own code without my permission. My strength, once a point of quiet pride, began to wane. The briefcase filled with financial reports that I used to swing with ease now felt heavy. I struggled to open a stubborn jar of pickles one evening, my grip failing, and had to give up in frustration, my face burning with a strange, new kind of shame. My shoulders, once broad and solid, seemed to be narrowing, the sharp angles of my frame softening into something gentler. The very architecture of my body was being remodeled. My nights became sleepless. I would lie awake for hours, my mind racing, cataloging every new sensation, every subtle shift. I'd trace the new faint curve of my hip, feel the unfamiliar softness of my thighs, and a wave of dizzying vertigo would wash over me. Who was I becoming? The denial crumbled completely one Tuesday evening. I had just gotten out of the shower and was toweling off when I glanced in the fogged-up mirror. I wiped a clear patch with my hand and leaned in. My nascent breasts were more defined now, impossible to ignore. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. It was my nipples. They had grown larger, the areolas darker and more pronounced, standing out against the pale, soft skin of my chest. They looked unmistakably, terrifyingly female. A guttural sound, a strangled gasp, escaped my lips. I stumbled back, my wet feet slipping on the bath mat. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white, and stared at the alien reflection in the mirror. The face was mine, but the body was becoming something else. The panic I'd felt before was a gentle tremor compared to this. This was a full-blown earthquake. My lungs seized, and I couldn't draw a proper breath. The room started to spin, the white-tiled walls closing in on me. I fumbled for the light switch, then another, and another, until every light in the apartment was blazing, chasing away the shadows, but they couldn't chase away the truth that was written on my own body. "No," I whispered, the word barely audible over the frantic pounding in my ears. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the coal floor, my head in my hands. My body was trembling, racked with a terror so profound it felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. "This can't be happening to me," I choked out, the words dissolving into a desperate, ragged sob. This can't be real. But it was real, and in the harsh, unforgiving light of my bathroom, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The panic eventually subsided, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of dread in my stomach. I spent the next day in a fog, moving through the motions at work like an automaton, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear and confusion. But beneath the chaos, a single insistent memory kept surfacing: the taste of that coffee, the chemical bitterness, the syrupy aftertaste. And along with it, the image of Marcus's face, his eyes holding that triumphant, knowing glint. He had done this. He had to have. The thought was insane, monstrous, but it was the only variable that fit the terrifying new equation of my life. That evening, I didn't turn on the lights when I got home. I moved through the silent apartment like a ghost, my heart pounding with a new kind of energy, not panic, but a grim, determined fury. I went straight to the kitchen. My first target was the trash can under the sink. I pulled it out, ignoring the mess of coffee grounds and vegetable peels, and dumped the contents onto a spread of old newspapers on the floor. My hands shook as I sifted through the garbage, my disgust overridden by desperation, and then I saw it. Tucked inside a crumpled takeout bag was a small, empty bottle. It was plastic, with a cheerful pastel pink label that was jarringly out of place amongst the grime. There was no brand name, just some chemical compound names in fine print and a symbol I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. I pocketed the small vial and moved to Marcus's side of the apartment. It felt like a violation, a crossing of a line I had never imagined I would approach. But I was past caring about roommate etiquette. His room was its usual disaster zone of canvases, clothes, and empty mugs. I searched his desk, his drawers, even the pockets of a paint-stained jacket slung over his chair. Nothing. Finally, I returned to the kitchen, my eyes scanning every surface. My gaze landed on the spice rack above the stove, a chaotic jumble of exotic herbs and unlabeled jars. Marcus's domain, tucked behind a large container of paprika, almost completely hidden, was another bottle. This one was full of small, pale pink pills, identical to the logo on the empty one from the trash. I held it up to the dim light from the window. I didn't know what it was, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that it was the source of my living nightmare. My next step was to turn to the one place where all questions, no matter how terrifying, could be answered: the internet. I sat at my laptop, my fingers trembling as I typed in the symptoms I'd been experiencing: male breast tenderness, sudden emotional sensitivity in men, softer skin, loss of muscle mass. The results flooded my screen, article after article, forum after forum, all pointing in the same horrifying direction. I saw words I vaguely recognized but had never paid attention to: estrogen, hormone replacement therapy, HRT, feminizing hormones. I read about the effects of estrogen on the male body: breast development, redistribution of body fat, skin softening, decreased muscle mass, and heightened emotional responses. It was a perfect, sickening checklist of every single change I had been enduring. Every bizarre sensation, every moment of shame and confusion suddenly had a name. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a psychological breakdown. I had been poisoned. When Marcus came home a few hours later, I was waiting for him in the living room. I sat in my minimalist gray armchair, the only light coming from the single floor lamp beside me, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room. The empty pink bottle and the full one were sitting on the stark white coffee table between us. He stopped in the doorway, sensing the tension immediately. He dropped his messenger bag to the floor with a thud. Dramatic lighting. "James, new hobby?" he asked, his voice laced with its usual sarcasm, but his eyes were wary. I didn't answer. I just pointed a shaking finger at the bottles on the table. "Explain this," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "Right now." He walked closer, his eyes flicking from the bottles to my face. The smugness returned to his lips, but this time it was colder, sharper. Finally figured it out. "Did you? I was wondering how long it would take the numbers guy to connect the dots." The casual admission sent a jolt of white-hot rage through me. You put hormones in my coffee." The words felt absurd, like a line from a movie. Not my life. "Just enough to get you started," he confirmed. Crossing his arms, he had the gall to look proud of himself. A little chemical nudge. Consider it an art project or a lesson. A lesson for what? I roared, surging to my feet. The sudden movement made my head swim. "What did I ever do to you that deserved this?" His face darkened, the smugness evaporating and replaced by a raw, bitter anger I had never seen in him before. "Elise," he spat, the name hitting me like a physical blow. Elise, we had dated, briefly, a few months ago. It was a casual thing. A few weeks of dinner and drinks before we both mutually, and I thought, amicably, decided it wasn't going anywhere. I barely thought of her anymore. "What about her?" I asked, confused. "You slept with her," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You knew I loved her. You knew I was trying to build something with her, and you just waltzed in with your stupid suit and your stable job and you took her. You break everything you touch. James, you broke her and you broke me." I stared at him, stunned into silence. I had no idea. He had never said a word. He'd watched me go out with her, watched me come home, and he had never given any indication of his feelings. The revelation was shocking, but it was nothing compared to the venom in his next words. He took a step closer, his eyes raking over me, from my slightly softer jawline to my chest, which was noticeably full even under my sweater. The anger in his expression slowly morphed into something else, a strange, clinical curiosity. "Though, I have to admit," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I never expected it would suit you so well. You're taking to it like a fish to water." He let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. "Maybe you never really wanted to be a man in the first place." His words hit me harder than a punch. My rage, which had been a clear and righteous fire, suddenly faltered, choked by a plume of thick, confusing smoke. The accusation was meant to be the ultimate insult, a final twist of the knife, but somewhere, in a deep, dark, and terrified part of my soul that I had kept locked away for my entire life, a small voice whispered a single devastating word. "True." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. I was a victim of a malicious, vengeful act, but in that one shattering moment, Marcus had inadvertently handed me a key to a prison I never even knew I was in, and I was terrified of what would happen if I used it. The confrontation with Marcus left a gaping hole in my reality. I was furious, violated, and deeply afraid, but his final, cruel words had lodged themselves in my mind like a splinter, and I couldn't dig them out. "Maybe you never really wanted to be a man in the first place." It was an absurd, poisonous idea, yet it echoed with a strange and terrifying resonance. I spent the next few days in a self-imposed exile, calling in sick to work and barely leaving my room. I avoided Marcus completely. The apartment, once a neutral territory of shared expenses, now felt like a battleground. I needed to think, to process the impossible truth of my situation. My body was continuing its quiet, relentless transformation under the influence of the hormones, and with every passing hour, the man in the mirror looked a little less like the James I knew. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while Marcus was out, I found myself standing in front of my closet. My entire wardrobe consisted of gray, navy, and black suits, an army of identical button-down shirts, and a few pairs of sensible jeans for the weekend. It was a uniform for a life I had meticulously built, a life of logic and control. Now, it all felt like a costume. My mind drifted to Elise when she had moved out of her last apartment. She'd left a box of things she couldn't fit in her car, asking if I could hold on to it for a while. I'd shoved it in the back of my closet and forgotten all about it. Now, driven by an impulse I couldn't name, part curiosity, part desperation, I pulled the dusty cardboard box out into the light. Inside was a jumble of her life, books, a few picture frames, and a pile of clothes. My hands trembled as I lifted out a simple, sleeveless blouse made of deep blue silk. The fabric felt impossibly soft, cool and fluid against my fingertips. My skin, now so much more sensitive, tingled at the touch. My heart was pounding. This was insane. I was a man. I was James. I was the victim of a sick prank. But the blouse in my hands felt like a question. After a long, agonizing moment of hesitation, I slipped off my t-shirt. My reflection in the closet mirror was a study in conflict. My face was still mine, but my chest now had the soft, distinct swell of small breasts. My shoulders were narrower, my waist subtly more defined. With trembling fingers, I pulled the silk blouse over my head. The moment the fabric settled against my skin, a shudder went through me. It was a sensation unlike anything I had ever felt. The silk didn't just lie on my skin. It seemed to merge with it. It draped over my new curves, clinging gently to the swell of my chest and the slight taper of my waist. It was soft, light, and liberating. The rough, restrictive feel of my own clothes was a prison I hadn't realized I was in until this very moment. I stared at my reflection. The man in the mirror was gone. In his place was a strange, androgynous figure, a confusing blend of masculine and feminine. But for the first time in my life, the person looking back at me didn't feel like a complete stranger. There was a flicker of something else, something I couldn't identify. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was recognition, a sense of rightness that was as terrifying as it was profound. This secret, hesitant exploration became a ritual. When Marcus was gone, I would pull out the box. I tried on a soft, form-fitting sweater that hugged my torso in a way that felt both scandalous and comforting. I even dared to slip into a simple A-line skirt, the fabric swishing against my newly smooth legs, a sensation that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated pleasure through me. Each article of clothing was a revelation, awakening senses I never knew I had. But these stolen moments were not enough. The confusion and curiosity were growing into a desperate need for answers. I needed to see if this feeling of rightness was just a delusion brought on by my bizarre circumstances, or if it was something more. A few weeks later, I worked up the courage to do something I would have once considered unthinkable. I drove to a large shopping mall in the next town over, a place where no one would know me. My stomach was in knots. I walked through the main entrance, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my men's jeans, my head down. The men's section was on the left, a familiar territory of denim and dark colors. The women's section was on the right, a vibrant, overwhelming world of silks, laces, and styles I couldn't begin to comprehend. It took me 20 minutes of pacing back and forth before I could force my feet to turn right. I felt like every eye in the department store was on me. My face burned with shame, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I walked aimlessly, my fingers brushing against soft fabrics, my mind screaming at me to turn around and run. "Can I help you find something?" The voice was gentle, and I jumped, spinning around. A woman in her late 20s with kind eyes and a warm smile was looking at me. Her name tag read Sophie. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I was paralyzed by fear and embarrassment. Sophie's smile didn't falter. She seemed to understand something I couldn't articulate. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice low and reassuring. "Sometimes finding the right fit is about more than just the size. We're here to help you find what makes you feel like you." Her simple, profound acceptance was like a key turning in a lock. A tear I hadn't realized was forming slipped down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away. I don't know where to start," I whispered, my voice hoarse. She guided me through the aisles with a gentle, professional grace. She asked about colors I liked, about fabrics I found comfortable. She didn't ask why I was there. She just accepted that I was. She helped me pick out a pair of women's dark-wash skinny jeans, a simple V-neck blouse in a lovely emerald green, and in my heart nearly stopping with the audacity of it, a simple soft-cup bra. In the privacy of the fitting room, I changed with shaking hands. The bra was the first thing. The sensation of the soft fabric cupping my sensitive breasts, the gentle support, the click of the clasp at the back, it was revolutionary. It felt correct. The jeans fit my new, softer hips perfectly, and the blouse draped beautifully, the V-neck subtly and elegantly framing my collarbones. When I stepped out to show Sophie, my terror was warring with a fragile, budding excitement. She looked at me, her head tilted, and her kind smile widened. "Wow," she said, her voice full of genuine appreciation. "That looks really right on you. You look so much more comfortable." And I was looking at my reflection in the three-way mirror. I saw it again, that flicker of recognition, but brighter this time. The shame was still there, a lingering shadow, but it was being pushed back by a new, brilliant light. I blushed, a real warm blush that spread across my cheeks, and for the first time, it didn't feel like shame. It felt feminine. I bought the entire outfit, my hands trembling as I handed over my credit card. Walking out of the mall, the bag felt both heavy as lead and light as a feather. I hadn't just bought clothes, I had bought a possibility. That night, alone in my room, dressed in my new clothes, I stood before the mirror for a long time. The man I was raised to be, the identity I had clung to, was dissolving. What Marcus had intended as a cruel act of revenge had instead become an unwilling act of liberation. He hadn't turned me into someone else. He had simply stripped away the layers of who I was pretending to be. A name floated into my mind, soft and unbidden. It was a name I had secretly loved since I was a child, a name I'd once seen in a book and held onto like a precious stone. It meant happiness, good fortune, things I had never truly felt as James. I looked at the reflection in the mirror, at the soft eyes, the gentle curves, the hesitant but hopeful smile. "My name," I whispered to the quiet room, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on my tongue, "is Felicity." The journey ahead was terrifying. I knew there would be pain, prejudice, and loss, but for the first time in my entire life, standing there in a pair of women's jeans and a simple green blouse, I felt the unmistakable, exhilarating thrill of hope. I was finally starting to come home to myself. The decision to live as Felicity was not a single lightning bolt moment, but a slow dawning sunrise. It began in the privacy of my apartment, wearing my new clothes after Marcus had gone to bed. It grew stronger with each secret trip to the mall, each new item of clothing a soft cardigan, a pair of elegant flats, a simple silver necklace that made my reflection feel more and more correct. The biggest, most terrifying step was deciding to bring Felicity into the light of day. I started small, a drive in my car wearing a simple dress, my hair grown out a little longer and brushed carefully. Then a late-night walk through a quiet park. Each excursion was a cocktail of fear and exhilaration. I was convinced every person I saw was staring, judging, but mostly, they were lost in their own worlds. The world didn't stop and point. It just kept going. The hardest part was the internal work. I started practicing my voice, speaking softly into a recorder, trying to find a pitch that felt more natural. It was a slow, often frustrating process. I watched makeup tutorials online for hours, my first attempts with mascara and foundation clumsy and comical. But with each small success, a perfectly drawn line of eyeliner, a vocal tone that sounded less forced, my confidence grew. I also made a crucial decision to take control of my own body. What Marcus had started maliciously, I would continue with intention. I found a clinic that specialized in transgender healthcare and made an appointment. Sitting in the waiting room, my heart hammered against my ribs. But for the first time, it was my choice. The doctor was kind and professional, and after several consultations and blood tests, I walked out with a legitimate prescription for estrogen and testosterone blockers. Holding that prescription in my hand felt like a monumental victory. I was no longer a victim of a chemical assault. I was a woman actively pursuing her own transition. The next great wall to climb was my job. The idea of walking into my sterile corporate office as Felicity was petrifying for weeks. I agonized over it, playing out every disastrous scenario in my head. But hiding was becoming more painful than the fear of revealing myself. Living two lives was exhausting. It was time. I scheduled a meeting with human resources and my direct supervisor. I rehearsed what I would say 100 times. Walking into that meeting, dressed in a conservative but feminine navy blue dress and a simple blazer, was the longest walk of my life. I am transgender, I said, my voice shaking but clear. From now on, I will be living and working as Felicity, and I will be using she/her pronouns. There was a moment of stunned silence that felt like an eternity. Then, to my utter astonishment, my supervisor, a stern man I'd always found intimidating, simply nodded. "Okay, Felicity," he said, testing the name. "Thank you for telling us. We'll make sure everyone in the department is informed and respectful." The support wasn't universal. Of course, there were awkward stares, whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, and a few people who stubbornly avoided using my new name. But most of my colleagues were surprisingly accepting, if a little curious. My greatest ally emerged from the cubicle next to mine, Donna, a kind-hearted woman in her 50s who had always been a quiet but steady presence, became my workplace guardian angel. The day after my announcement, she leaned over the partition. "I just wanted to say, that dress is a lovely color on you," she said with a warm smile. "If this is who you truly are, dear, then I'm so happy for you." Donna's simple act of kindness opened the floodgates. She became my confidant, giving me tips on corporate-appropriate attire, helping me fix my makeup when my eyeliner smudged, and fiercely correcting anyone who misgendered me. Her friendship was a lifeline in those early, difficult days. As weeks turned into months, living as Felicity began to feel less like a performance and more like my reality. My body continued to soften and curve. My hips widened, my waist narrowed, and my breasts filled out, becoming a permanent and welcome part of me. The feeling of wearing a silk blouse against my skin or the gentle sway of a skirt around my legs was no longer a novelty. It was just normal. It was my life. I even started to notice a different kind of attention. Men would hold doors for me. Strangers would smile at me on the street. One afternoon, a man in a coffee shop told me he liked my laugh, and I blushed so hard I had to hide my face behind my cup. These small moments were both thrilling and unnerving, subtle affirmations of the woman I was becoming. It was during this period of blossoming that Daniel came back into my life. He was a former client, someone I'd worked with briefly as James over a year ago. I ran into him at a cafe downtown. I was sitting by the window enjoying a quiet Saturday when he approached my table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you look incredibly familiar. I feel like we've met before." I looked up into a pair of warm, hazel eyes. I recognized him immediately. My heart skipped a beat. "It's possible," I said, offering a small, nervous smile. "Maybe in another life." His name was Daniel, and he was even more handsome than I remembered. He was intrigued by my cryptic answer, and we ended up talking for over an hour. He was charming, intelligent, and treated me with a gentle respect that was intoxicating. He asked for my number, and I gave it to him, my hand shaking slightly as I typed the digits into his phone. Our first few dates were magical. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Daniel had a way of making me feel seen, not as a curiosity, but as a person. He was subtly flirtatious, his compliments always sincere, his touch, when he'd gently guide me through a doorway with a hand on the small of my back, sending shivers down my spine. With him, I felt a kind of soft, fluttering vulnerability I had never experienced as James. The hard, defensive shell I had lived in for so long was beginning to melt away. But a shadow loomed over our budding romance my past. I knew I had to tell him. The thought terrified me. What if he was disgusted? What if he saw me as a lie? After our fourth date, I invited him back to my new apartment. I had finally moved out of the place I shared with Marcus. As we sat on the couch, a comfortable silence between us, I knew it was time. "Daniel," I began, my voice barely a whisper, "there's something you need to know about me." My heart pounded as I told him everything. I told him about James, about the life I used to live, about the coffee, and about my journey to becoming Felicity. I didn't look at him, staring instead at my hands, which were twisting nervously in my lap. When I finished, the silence was deafening. I braced myself for rejection. Then, I felt his hand gently cover mine. I looked up. He was looking at me with an expression of such tenderness it made my breath catch. "Felicity," he said, his voice soft but firm, "the past you're telling me about doesn't matter nearly as much as the incredible woman sitting in front of me right now. And that woman is beautiful." A single tear rolled down my cheek, but this time, it wasn't a tear of shame or fear. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated relief. He saw me. He saw me. He gently wiped the tear away with his thumb, his touch warm against my skin. "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me," he whispered, leaning in closer. In that moment, as his lips met mine for the first time in a kiss that was both gentle and full of promise, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer walking it alone. I was building a new life, one filled with friendship, acceptance, and the sweet, unexpected possibility of love. My relationship with Daniel became the anchor in my new life. He was my biggest cheerleader and my safest harbor. He loved me for being Felicity, not in spite of it. He celebrated my milestones with me the day my new driver's license arrived with the correct name and gender marker. The first time I felt confident enough to wear a swimsuit at the beach. The anniversary of my first hormone shot. His love wasn't just accepting, it was affirming. It taught me that I was worthy of happiness, not as a reformed version of a man, but simply as the woman I was. Living with him in his bright, airy apartment felt like breathing clean air for the first time after a lifetime in a stuffy room. We fell into a rhythm of domestic bliss that I had never imagined for myself. Cooking dinner together, his arms wrapping around my waist from behind as I stirred a sauce, waking up in his arms, his chin resting on the top of my head. These small, mundane moments of intimacy were more precious to me than any financial portfolio I had ever managed. But there was one final thread to my old life that I needed to sever. I had moved out of the apartment I shared with Marcus in a hurry, leaving behind books, old records, and other remnants of James Anderson. I knew I had to go back one last time to collect my things and, more importantly, to close that chapter for good. I arranged to go on a weekday when I knew he would be there. As I let myself in with my old key, the familiar smell of turpentine and stale coffee hit me, and a wave of anxiety washed over me. Marcus was in the living room, sketching in a notepad. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. He looked thinner, more worn out than I remembered. The arrogant, caustic artist seemed to have been replaced by someone quieter, more subdued. "Came for the rest of your stuff," I said, my voice steady. I refused to let him see me tremble. "It's in your old room, boxed up," he replied, not meeting my eyes. I spent the next hour clearing out the last vestiges of my former self. As I taped up the final box, I knew I couldn't leave without saying what I needed to say. I walked back into the living room. Marcus was still on the couch, pretending to be absorbed in his drawing. "I don't forgive you, Marcus," I said, the words hanging in the tense silence. He finally looked up at me. There was no smirk, no defiance, just a deep, hollow sadness in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "What you did was cruel and unforgivable," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You tried to destroy my life out of jealousy and spite. You treated me like one of your twisted art projects." He flinched but didn't argue. He just nodded, his gaze dropping back to the floor. I took a deep breath. "But I have to admit something, too, forcing me out of that life. You broke open a cage I didn't even realize I was trapped in. I spent my whole life trying to be the man I thought I was supposed to be: logical, unemotional, successful, and I was miserable. I was suffocating." I looked down at my hands, at the slender fingers and smooth skin. I touched the soft fabric of my dress. "Because of you. I had no choice but to face a truth I had buried so deep I couldn't even see it myself. You didn't create Felicity. She was always here. You just burned down the building she was hiding in." I looked him straight in the eye, and for that, for accidentally setting me free, I found a happiness I never thought was possible. For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus looked completely stripped of his sarcasm and cynicism. He looked small and broken. "I'm sorry, James," he said, using my old name, perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because he was apologizing to the person he had wronged. "It's Felicity," I corrected him gently, "and I hope one day you find a way to build things instead of just breaking them." I turned and walked out of that apartment for the last time, the click of the closing door a definitive, satisfying sound. I didn't look back. The past was finally where it belonged, behind me. A few months later, on a beautiful autumn morning, I was standing in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom I shared with Daniel. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the room in a soft, golden light. I was wearing a simple pale yellow sundress. My hair, now shoulder length, fell in soft waves around my face. I traced the line of my collarbone, my gaze traveling down to my soft shoulders and the gentle curve of my breasts. I saw the swell of my hips, the smoothness of my legs. My body was still changing, still settling into its final form, but it felt like mine in a way it never had before. There was no trace of the hard, angular man who had once stared back from mirrors with a perpetually clenched jaw. Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. He smiled at my reflection in the mirror. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I leaned back into his embrace, a genuine, unforced smile spreading across my face. It was a smile that reached my eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that felt new and wonderful. This wasn't the story of a man whose life was stolen from him. It wasn't a story of revenge or tragedy. It had started that way, with a bitter taste in a cup of coffee. But it had become something else entirely. It was the story of a woman who had to be broken apart to finally become whole. My journey had been born from an act of malice, but I had reclaimed it. I had fought through fear, shame, and uncertainty to seize a life that was authentically mine. The path to finding myself had been painful, unexpected, and utterly terrifying. But standing here, safe in the arms of a man who loved me, I knew without a doubt that every single step had been worth it. "I'm thinking," I said, my voice filled with a quiet, profound joy, "that I'm finally home." "And Felicity finally was